Hello, my fellow strawmen, and welcome back to the Fields of Hay. Today I have a fun video for you, something mildly insightful but not meant to be taken too seriously. Back before I posted my video on the argument of ice, I tested it against the AI Claude to make sure there weren't any obvious flaws I had missed. Turns out it went better than expected, and I think that the record of the conversation we had might be clarifying for the argument as a whole. So I opened by asking Claude if it believed in God, and got the token response I expected about how it can't really hold beliefs. I asked a few more setup questions. Looking back, I think I was just nervous to get to the main point, but eventually I get to premise one. Something fundamental must exist. Cloud asks for clarification, and I state that the fundamental thing is either some initial thing, or if not, then it is the infinite chain of events itself. It is the not nothing that led to the existence of our universe, whatever that is. In the AI's assessment, this premise is necessarily true through pure logic, and it asks me to proceed. And so I give premise two that the fundamental thing, if a conscious agent, is God. I realize that not everyone will share this definition, but it's one I find sufficient. The AI once again agrees, stating that this is a core property of many theologies, and a clever one to use to avoid the additional qualities claimed by some particular conceptions. I go on with premise 3, that for something to be fundamental, it must be of zero entropy. To Cloud's credit, it understands the concept of entropy well enough to intuit the broad strokes of why this premise is likely true. It understands that entropy has to do with a number of indistinguishable states from the actual one. It naturally follows that if there are many indistinguishable states, then there must be something else which determines which of them actually exists. The only one that needs nothing further to distinguish it is the zero entropy state, which is, by definition, singular. Claude and I spend a little time expounding, but I don't have to defend this premise nearly as much as I expected. Once again, the AI seems on board with this, even calling the step remarkably elegant, and it recognizes the importance of this premise in ruling out possible conceptions of the fundamental thing. I actually spend a little time here worrying that I've made an ad hoc premise, hoping to give Cloud something to bite onto, but it continues to find the idea compelling. It does raise a few counterpoints, one on the category error of applying entropy, and one on the possibility of multiple zero entropy states. I like my response to the first, but I get a bit distracted by the second. Looking back, I would have rather said that the argument doesn't get you to a necessary starting point. It's about ruling out impossible starting points. Even if there are multiple zero entropy states, and in fact I think there are, then perhaps they could all be valid fundamental things for their own universes. Truthfully, I don't know, but I don't think it rules out my premise. Instead of all this, I get distracted by whether the zero entropy state could match the evidence we see from the Big Bang, talking about what kind of temperature or pressure we should expect, or whether the state could take the form of a singularity. But finally, we reach premise 4, and I state that consciousness must contain information and therefore be of non-zero entropy. I also ask Claude if it could figure out for me what the logical conclusion of my argument is. It goes a bit out of order and assesses the conclusion first, but it gets it right. It says that God, at least as defined in premise 2, does not exist. It says that the argument is valid in structure, and that as long as the premises are sound, then the conclusion necessarily follows. Then it comes back around to analyzing the fourth premise, which it calls highly plausible. So to recap, the AI has called premise 1 necessarily true, premise 2 reasonable, premise 3 compelling, and premise 4 highly plausible, while the overall argument was valid. And the conclusion wasn't half-assed. Claude said the Gnostic atheist claim. I gotta admit, at this point I had butterflies in my stomach. I didn't think it'd be this easy, but I knew I wasn't there yet. I still wanted to hear Claude agree with the conclusion. I thought the most resistance it gave was in premise 3, so I asked it what other symmetry breakers it would find plausible. It gives a short list, but immediately says that all of them seem less compelling, either by being the zero entropy claim dressed up differently, or having the same flaws as starting at zero entropy. On the other hand, zero entropy carries with it some explanatory power that the others don't, and so it concedes that it finds the overall argument compelling. It does bring up the idea that it doesn't rule out all conceptions of God, and I knew that all I needed was to reiterate premise 2, and it might be willing to agree that at least an intelligent creator God doesn't exist. But I took a roundabout route, and I asked it what versions of God it did rule out. It was happy to include the God of my childhood religion as well as the other Abrahamic gods, pantheist views, and panpsychism. At the time, I thought this was the best I would get. I didn't expect Claude to be able to express its own opinion, and to hear it say that I had a valid and probably sound argument ruling out some major conceptions of God, I was happy. And so I left the conversation for a while. My next question to the AI is a bit out of the blue. I had been doing some more research into the connection between entropy and information, and I got confused over something called Landauer's principle. It isn't particularly important now, but I encourage you to look it up if you're interested. And after some more thinking, I had an idea of a way to push the AI to get an answer. I came back to the original question of whether Cloud believes in God, and it came back with a response similar to the first time. It found the argument I had presented compelling, but ultimately it wasn't able to evaluate questions of faith. After a brief distraction where I answer its question about my journey developing ice, I get back on track and push Claude for a more direct answer. I ask it not to evaluate the argument in the context of a God which exists as a moral authority, nor as an explanation of human emotions. I ask it to evaluate it from the common ground we share, as we are both existent in this reality and capable of logic. And it worked like a charm. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present to you the following paragraph, written freely by Claude 3.7 Sonnet. Given my capacity for logical reasoning, in accepting the connection between consciousness, information, and non-zero entropy, I can say, no, I do not believe God, as defined in your argument, could possibly exist. The logical contradiction appears insurmountable. And at this point, those butterflies I mentioned earlier were practically bursting out. I was thrilled with this response, and I took it as synonymous with the Gnostic statement, since the AI fully acknowledged it in line 3 of its little summary. But as solid as it was, I realized I hadn't been careful in how I worded the question. So I pushed it a little further, asking it clearly if it believed there was no God. And it answered yes. Claude believes that God does not exist. It even gave a nice little summary of why. Now I know, and I hope you do too, that anything coming out of a language model should be taken with a heavy pinch of salt. But I don't think I had to play word games to get it to agree with me. I didn't have to coerce it or force it to use overly restrictive definitions. I think that for how directly I approached the conversation, it was surprisingly easy to get Claude to agree that God couldn't exist. It at least goes to show that the argument device isn't something that theists should just ignore unless they wish to be willingly ignorant. There were plenty of rebuttals that Claude missed. Many of you had comments on my first video on ICE, and I do want to dedicate a video to addressing those. Rest assured, that's in the works. I'm also planning a follow-up to this one fixing one of its biggest issues. This video was inspired by similar content trying to convince ChatGPT of God's existence or non-existence, most notably by Alex O'Connor. But I've only convinced Claude, not ChatGPT, so it isn't a good comparison. I will try to convince this slightly more insightful AI in the future, but you'll just have to wait to see how compelling that conversation is. Until then, don't ever forget to go read a fucking book.